for posterity.
Very much welcome today. We've got a very special treat for you at the Working Class Movement Library, because I'm delighted to welcome Library Trustee Maxine Peake, who is going to be introducing today's talk. Over to you, Maxine.
Hiya. Thank you, everybody. Great to see so many people. I can see about 5. But welcome to another fantastic Working Class Movement Library virtual talk. These have been absolutely brilliant, so thanks to Lynette and Jane and everyone at the library for organising these. So today's talk is about Betty Tebbs, and that's why we're all here. I suppose most of us know Betty, knew Betty, had heard of Betty. She was a great friend of the library. I was fortunate enough to call her a friend through meeting her at the Working Class Movement Library when there was an event where I was asked to read from her memoirs, her fantastic memoirs, if you can get a copy of those as well. So I'm just here to introduce Mark Metcalf, who's written a fantastic leaflet on Betty's life. She was a peace activist, a trade unionist, a women's rights activist. I mean, and she wasn't just, as we know, an armchair activist. Betty got out there. She was, you know, we know about Faslane when she chained herself across the road and was carted away, and then in the cell said she needed a heart tablet, so the police quickly released her. But she's been a real inspiration to me for many years, and obviously, sadly, we lost her recently. But yeah, and Mark's written this just fantastic piece about Betty and her inspirational life, and I think she's a real icon for us all, and to continue the struggle. So that's for me, really. And I just want to say before I sign off and hand over to Mark, is these are for free talks, but it would be wonderful if you could, I know times are really difficult, but go to the Working Class Movement library page and click donate, and whatever you can spare, just to keep this facility going, because it's just fantastic to be able to see you all at this time and know that we're not alone, and the struggle goes on and it'll get harder, but you know, the library's there to support and encourage us. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
That's great. I am going to start the presentation, and if you want at this point, folks, to just hide the little videos on the side there, you can do that. There's little buttons at the top where you can see the active speaker, or just delete all of them and just see the full slideshow, which hopefully you can now see. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Over to you.
Yes, welcome to everybody. Thanks to Maxine for introducing her good friend. Amongst the other things that Betty was, is that she was an author, and that much as I'm pleased to have put this work together, and you can get copies and download them for free at this stage, both from the Mark's Memorial Library, where it's online with the Oral History Project, and my own website at markwright.co.uk. You will see at the beginning of that I've put written and compiled, because in truth it's a edited version of Betty's own work, which she completed up till 1997. The fact is, she lived for a lot longer after that, as well, of course, for which that was a very good thing. I think it's fantastic, isn't it, when you're growing up at whatever age, to meet people who've been involved in a lifelong struggle, and because that inspires you when you yourself think, well, you know, I've done my bit, and then somebody like Betty comes along and says, hang on a second, you're not dead yet, and you can contribute in small ways, even if it's just passing on little bits of information from their own lives. Those are essential to inspiring the future generation. And it was one of the reasons initially, when about 6 or 7 years ago, Unite, the education officer, asked if I would use my own trade union and political and anti-fascist experiences in particular, and anti-racism, being inspired upon all sorts of things. Similar situation to what Betty herself would have had to suffer as a result of being an industrial and political militant. So she became an author. So she told her tale. She understood that there was something special about the fact that she had undertaken so many struggles that they should be passed on. And I would urge people on here to make sure that they do record their own experiences to be passed on to as many people as possible, so they can be shared with their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. One of the reasons why I've put this particular work on at the beginning is that I don't know if anybody's had the opportunity to join also the British Newspaper Archives, which is now updating most of the papers. 20% of papers are now scanned, in essence. So just as the working class movement and library is keeping alive the struggle of our class, the British Newspaper Archive is keeping alive what has happened in the past. Why was this particular date so important? Well, it was the 10th of April, it was 1918. The First World War was coming towards an end. And the end of that, the Zeppelin, those great, horrendous war killing machines ultimately, managed to make its way across England. I'm not sure they're after Betty at that particular point, but they did come fairly close to where she was being born in Bury. And the connection with Betty is pretty clear, because she herself, her generation, was to be marked by war, wasn't it? That was the situation. The fact was she stood out with some people, not enough people, in campaigning for peace throughout the rest of her life. So that's the reason why I put that on there. It was the same day, and she was coming out and she was going to try and oppose. She wasn't a pacifist, of course, Betty, in that respect. She certainly wasn't when it came to Spain and other issues, which we'll develop as we move forward on this talk. So there you are. That's Betty's birthday, as they say, the day she was born. Her parents, her mum was a domestic servant, and her father was a joiner and a glazer. And her mum, being a domestic servant, meant she was often away from home. So Betty was brought up by her grandma, and that's who she got that initial love from. So just as we're talking about passing on the generations, that was what happened to Betty at that particular period in her early life. She had a couple of siblings. She went off to school where she liked sport. She also liked singing, although she didn't like the religious element that went with the singing. She stood up for herself at a pretty early age. There was an unpleasant situation where a local man, obviously with a few quid, he came in and he would throw nuts on the floor around Christmas, and the kids would pile down to try and get those nuts. And Betty, she wasn't nuts. She decided, I ain't having none of that. So she wouldn't do that. And for that, she was sent home. She missed schooling because she had rheumatic fever. So she was off for a canny while. Nevertheless, when she was 14, she passed one part of her 11 plus and narrowly failed the second part of that. With a little bit of a fee, you could say, you know, that's how lots of middle-class people get in, with a little bit of a fee and a good education. She could have gone, you know, up to the grammar. She could have done well. That would have been an individualistic solution to the fact that her family were in great poverty very often throughout her life. But her dad, obviously a degree of jealousy here. He had passed the same exam before, but he'd been unable to go. So he basically said, well, hang on, if you haven't passed both the exams, we shouldn't do that. And you should go up to the secondary school, which is where she went. She didn't particularly like it. And she was happy to leave school at 14. A quick thing on the sports thing, which is a really nice tale. Betty was also, later on, she continued doing running, and she ended up running with one of the lassies who won a bronze medal at the Olympics. The other women who were sharing the facilities didn't like this woman. This woman shaved, and she spoke with a very deep voice. And Betty was having none of that. So Betty basically ran, got changed. And so she was shown at these early ages that she was not a person to be intimidated by the feelings or thoughts of other people if she felt she was in the right. And of course, she was in the right. And the fact was, on many occasions, she was in the right. She was fighting for herself. And initially, that was what she was fighting for, fighting for herself and fighting for her family. Well, we sort of know those two, don't we, to be honest with you. She left school, obviously it was 1932. 1932, I mean, obviously at the Wall Street crash and an economic depression. Her father, he was out of work. And so if she could find some work, this was going to be great. It was going to add to the family income. And she stood outside one of the paper mills. And what happened was that they wouldn't let her start at the paper mills. It was a good and a bad thing, wasn't it, in many occupations. Later became a racial thing used badly against black workers in the 60s and 70s. But at that stage, it was, if you had a family member in the location or the workplace, you had more of a chance of getting a start. And she never had anybody in their workplace. So her and a mate of hers stood outside for months, and then they went other places. She was offered a post with the travelling circus, and her mum said, "You're not going, that'll be serious exploitation." To get it right, her mum was no working class militant. Her mum voted Tory, although interestingly, she had considered having an abortion of Betty because of the poverty and the two children. In 1935, I think it was Summerskill, the MP, stood locally for Labour, and she voted for her because she was in favour of additional abortion rights. So she was taking, her own needs at that point. Anyway, Betty eventually did get a start at Wiles. She was delighted, and she was on the end of a paper cutting machine. And so she was sorting stuff out into reams, and she was delighted to get the princely sum of what would be 52.5 pence a week. And she took that home, and she was really pleased. Her pleasure turned to pain when she discovered that John, who was on the other end of the machine, who she'd got on very well with, who was doing exactly the same job, he was getting 65 pence. So he was on 25% more than she was for doing exactly the same job. Now, this didn't please her one little bit. Her mum had said that men and women were the same, and therefore she wanted the same pay. But of course, there was nothing she could do about it. Across the factory, men and women who were doing the same jobs, men were getting more pay. She joined, I'm difficulty in actually getting the whole of this out. So if I have a quick look at the booklet so I can say it properly, but it was the
While you're doing that, I'll just move, if I may, to the next slide, because there's a funny little orange box that I'm not able to get away.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to try and get away with it. So by moving to the next slide, if that's all right, Mark.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Keep going. That's not. Oh,
okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Oh, orange box still there. Sorry, folks. I don't know how to move that little orange box. Apologies. Keep going, Mark. Sorry.
Okay. And so she joined the National Union of Printing, Bookbinding and Paper Workers Union. Okay. It's now known as Unite, in essence, which would be a lot easier to get out, to be honest with you. So she joined the union. She was massively impressed by the shop steward, Elsie. She was really impressed. Elsie was sticking up for people. And then Elsie did, which I think many people will have experienced. Elsie joined the other side. She became part of management. And this shocked Betty. It really upset her. And her and our mate Una, they tried to organise a strike. Unfortunately, it's one of the first of many bitter experiences whereby the people around her, the females particularly around her, wouldn't engage in the industrial action. And so therefore the strike was defeated. Now, the reason why I put the next slide on, Benny Rothman, is of course Benny himself was also at this period of time, he was a little bit older than her. But just to say, in the series of booklets that I've done, I did a piece on quite a long booklet also on Benny, which is available for people to download. And with that, actually, we also made a little short documentary of about 13 minutes, which has been well shared and well watched. Just briefly, of course, you know, Benny was a Manchester laddie, also unemployed, who did extraordinary things, of which the most important would be the Kinder Scout trespass. Anyway, towards the late, as the war sort of moved into view, the Second World War, sadly, Betty was quite smitten by a young a laddie just a bit older than her. You know, she had quite the hots for him, to be honest with you. And he was a bit older than her, and he was called Ernest, okay? Now, one of the things which I found admirable in the 1997 autobiography, which Betty wrote about, is that she engages in the discussion on sex, which is not something that many people do or dare do, to be honest with you. But she talked about how difficult it was for the pair of them to stay together during that period when they were unable to engage in sexual activity. Ernest was not popular in her household because he wasn't working, and her own sister was married to a man who wasn't working, and this was causing tensions. Anyway, it managed that he got work at the same place where Betty was working. He was a bit of a stop and start situation, but he got a start and thus saved up money towards getting married. Now, Ernest was what I'd describe as a sort of a working class socialist. He learned through action and he learned through experience to some extent. The educational stuff comes, as I know from my own experiences later on, really. And anyway, he decided he had, whereas many people obviously went off to fight for the country, Ernest understood that the forces opposed were fascist, and he wanted to go off and fight. He wanted to do his bit. He was a brave individual. And so he came out of being a reserved occupation and he signed up and he joined the infantry. And him and Betty got married on the 11th of November, 1939. And you can see there the photograph of the pair of them, both looking very splendid in all their kegs and both of them looking extremely smart. Yeah, it's a beautiful photograph, to be honest. And, you know, it's great to pass on such photographs. He went off. Betty, long story, left Wales. She went somewhere else. And then the government asked her to go and work at Mather and Platts. And actually, Ernest came home. He persuaded Betty to try and kickstart a family, and they were successful. The problem with that was that when he was away, if Betty had gone to her employer and said, look, I'm pregnant, she would have been sacked on the spot. So the situation was, she got a job as a crane driver, and it meant, although it was difficult to climb up into the cranes, it meant that she could out of the sight is out of mind. And she was able to save up the fantastic sum of about 50 quid, which at that period was about 16 weeks work. And what it meant was she would have enough money to quit. And when she did finally tell her employer, she was dismissed. Ernest went off. He went on D-Day. He went through France, and he was obviously a brave character. He wrote home. He makes descriptions about how the French peasantry in particular had done well, or the farmers had done well, and therefore the situation was he had to be extra careful. And he was killed, and the situation was a tragic one. This is the photograph of Betty and his daughter, Pat, who was trying to ring up earlier, as it happens, which is a shame, but has been a big supporter of doing the booklet and bringing Betty's life to a few more people. And I mean, there's a photograph if you move on from here where Betty eventually, there he is in all his, you know, looking smart, looking brave, looking determined to fight fascism. It's something massive admiration for, of course. And he, as I said, he lost his life. Betty later got the opportunity to go to his grave, lay some flowers, and obviously to remember her first husband. Pat had complications, so there was some problems. She had the sort of first like radiation at the Christie's Cancer Hospital. She came through. What happened was Betty's mum suggested she go down to Brixham. Okay, I'll try and answer that one a bit. In Brixham, down in Devon, which is where Betty's mum was from, and she met down there a lad called Len Tebbs. He had been educated at quite a high level, to be honest. He'd gone to the William Morris Grammar School. He had an understanding of communism, of socialism. They got on well. Len was able to explain to Betty some of the things she had sort of got to know herself by, as I said, by being a working class woman, by being exploited. They got on very well. They agreed to communicate. And to cut a long story short, not long after that, he came up, he stopped up in Lancashire. It was agreed they would get married, although at the time he was sent by the War Office back to Syria and the Middle East, and they didn't get married for a year. They had a child, Glyn, fairly sharpish into after they'd been married, and he was born without complications. So that was the first early period of Betty's life. So you've got fascism, you've got the war, you've got the struggle to make yourself, a decent sort of standard of living. But the most important event that happened in Betty's life at that period was on the 6th of August in 1945. And I'm hoping if we can come forward to that newspaper cutting, which I've chosen deliberately from actually, very briefly, I'll explain this as well. This is basically, when we talk about the war against fascism, myself, I mean, I've been a writer for about 10 years and now starting to use film and that sort of stuff. And this is a short film which myself and Adam have made using the fact that the Bolton Socialist Club put up a plaque to James Alwyn, and who was killed at the Battle of Harama in 1937. So that's also on my website. It's also on we're making a football film. It's also on there as well. So anybody who's interested, if you type in film documentary about James Alwyn, that'll tell you what it's about. It's good. I mean, a lot of people watched it. They managed to get it shown also to the one of the Yellow Vest movements and stuff down in France. So that's excellent. Very pleased about that. So the next issue for Betty, which stung her into action, in essence, was the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and obviously Nagasaki. And this, that's actually the letter which came home. There's a whole bit in the book where it explains how she found out he'd been killed, came home, hugely traumatic. She explains it very well in our own book, there's copies of which at the Working Class Movement and Library. So she found out, about the bombings. She was horrified. She was clearly tormented by the situation. But as you'll see from the paper which comes up next, many people, there you go, Turco begins wailing about inhumanity. the Yorkshire Evening Post never want to miss an opportunity to knock the working class, or in any shape, form or fashion. Obviously, it used to be called the Yorkshire and Conservative Evening Post. Probably should still be the case. And so there, it's basically saying that, you know, this was necessary to end the war. And as Betty pointed out to her friends, anybody who thinks, you know, Montgomery said it wasn't, Eisenhower said it wasn't, Truman's Chief of Staff said that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, that's still something which you hear people say, isn't it? I mean, I've been watching some stuff by the guy, James Reeve, and, you know, I watched his stuff about Japan the other week. And again, it was still the same story which is being told. It ended the war more quickly. It saved lives. In fact, it was a clear graphic demonstration that the Americans were going to be in charge of the rest of the century, that they could do what they wanted because they were the biggest boys with the biggest weapons. And that really set Betty on a course of work, which was to bring about the getting rid of such weapons. And obviously we'll come on to that. Delighted to hear that somebody from CND and Neville are here to listen in, and hopefully they'll give a bit of information as well. Len came north. He got a job at the same company as Betty, but he packed that in and he went to work at Triangle Valves. He didn't like working in the management, and so he got a job on the factory floor. He was able to do that because he had a union card. The fact was the factory, there he is. The fact was that at the time you had to have a trade union card. It was a closed shop, and it's the thing which prevented victimizations, wasn't it? If you turned up at a workplace and you had a union card, you got to start. So there was no possibility of management picking and choosing at that point. If you had a card, you could do the job, you got to start. That was it. Lads and lasses walked out if that wasn't the case. Len got a start. He had good money, and he began selling a daily worker at various workplaces and building a small number of people. They were both delighted when Labour were elected, of course, the Attlee government. And Betty spoke, and you can see it in her own work, at her absolute delight at the fact that, at the absolute, can you hear me? Hello? Still there, yeah? At the delight of the fact that what happened was that the NHS was set up. She was finally able to pay her debt down to her local doctor after about 6 months after the NHS came into being. And so that was great. She was delighted. They were, however, disappointed at the fact that the Labour government accepted the Marshall Plan. Betty and Len were people who were in the Labour Party at certain times and in the Communist Party at other times. They were in the Communist Party, for example, in 1956 and quit as they felt the Soviet Union hadn't understood what was happening at the time when the Hungarians went into revolt. So it was that sort of situation. So they're in the Labour Party under Attlee, but then quit. The next interesting bit from my point of view, and is the importance also of the necessity for socialist literature, is that in 1952, they were both using the Daily Worker to show that Britain's occupation of Malaya was not to the benefit of the Malayan people, which is what we're often told. Now it says Morning Star on there. Obviously, it wasn't the Morning Star there, but it was the sister. It was the of the paper, and it was it brought these stories to life, and it forced the ruling class, the Conservative government by then, to admit that what was happening in Malaya was, outright atrocities. The Malayans who fought more or less the Japanese on their own during the Second World War without any military or political support were now being slaughtered by the British, and that was the situation. They quit over this. They quit the Labour Party and they joined the Communist Party of Great Britain, because of such coverage. And clearly we continue to need such inspiration in terms of finding out about what is happening. It's incredibly difficult, as I know myself from the number of tales that I've been told as a journalist by friends of mine who've been in the military, who would like to speak out, but are simply not because of the Official Secrets Act. And that includes places all over the world. Some of them feel very guilty about the things that the crimes that they have committed. I have some marginal sympathy, to be honest with you, but not as much sympathy as I do for the people against who those crimes have been committed. Anyway, Betty, she got a job at Marks and Spencer's. She liked it. I mean, it was a nice place to work. They have good terms and conditions. They do still, to some extent, Marks and Spencer's have that. They have good canteens, and it's generally a decent enough place to work. But she went to the East Lancashire paper mill, and she became active in the union, in a sense that what she wanted is that, first off, she defended the lad who was collecting the money, Ernest. He was now collecting a lot more money because Betty had given him a lot more tasks. She'd recruited a lot of women to the union, and he was going round and collecting the money. He'd stayed with the East Lancashire paper mill during the Second World War. And then basically the company, they sacked him. The women came out. They actually came out on strike in support of him at Betty's initiative. But as Christmas came along, Ernest, he basically said, I can't take away your work, your wages over Christmas. And he decided not to. Now, at this point, the workers were defeated. And what happened was then management said to them, well, we'll pick and choose who comes back to work. And this gave the workers a chance to collect together, and eventually management backed down. So they went in not seeing themselves as defeated, but as having had a half success. And that was important to the building of the trade union structure. Betty continued to collect the monies, and eventually she became, I do love this, the mother of the chapel. And she was to do that role for 18 years, okay? 18 years, during which she turned the situation that women were amongst the best paid women locally, regionally, and nationally across the paper industry. So she was successful, and it's no wonder that she was highly respected across the factory floor. Now, Len lost his job at Triangle Valves, which is where he's working. He found work at Mather and Platts, and he stayed there for a long time, being a steward and the convener. And I do cover that in the booklet. This is the one which is in the wrong place, in essence. So you do have my apologies. Well, that's actually Betty later on speaking. Yes, it was SOGA. It was the National, I've just seen the question. It was the National Union of Paper Bookbinders and Workers thing. And that was the case until 1968 or 66, when SOGA came along. That actually is Betty speaking against nuclear testing in the Lenin Stadium a little bit later on, when she was very active in the National Assembly of Women. And I'll come on to that one. There's my fault. It's a mistake as such. So I kicked the butt. And there's Betty looking in all her splendor, as they would say, strong face, determined character. You can see it in her, can't you? As she's not going to take fools gladly, and she's going to stand up for herself. Now, she started to become more representative of her workforce. She went to the biennial conference in 1958 in Scarborough. There were 311 delegates in the National Union of Print, Bookbinding and Paper Workers Union, and 40 were women. So there was still a long way to go. One of the things, and I must have a look at my book here because I'm not entirely certain. One of the things which she was delighted to second in 1958 was a resolution from the Barrow branch, okay? And it said that women should be graded in the same way as men, according to the skill of their work, okay? And this was, she hadn't previously heard of this, actually. she hadn't really, I think, but it was those initial stirrings, you know, equal pay of equal value. You know, so if you were doing the same work, you know, then you got, or the similar thing, you got the same pay. So it wasn't that women were then pushed into one section and men pushed into another, and that section got more money. Women were starting to find ways around that, women and men, in terms of the situation. And so that it was a massive boost. She went to work and she used that. So she had the jobs graded, depend upon the skills that people were engaging in. And if women were engaging in the same skills, but in a different department, they got the same rates of pay as the men. And this was, you know, pre-Dagenham and pre-other places. So pre-Dagenham being 68, of course, when the Ford machinists walked out. She went back to the conference 2 years later, 62, and she was a delegate, and she spoke in favour of a resolution which was passed that opposed Britain's entry into the common market, which of course is still an ongoing issue of some debate amongst the trade union and labour movement. So what happened was then very disappointing to her, and was that Len had got a job teaching, and eventually he was down in Runcorn for 3 years. He was offered a permanent job, and he persuaded her to quit her job. And you can read in her work that she wasn't happy about this. She clearly viewed it as some degree of misogyny on the part of her husband, and she later criticised him also in the work for not having supported her in some internal struggles within what was SOCAT. So you can imagine she certainly had a number of vigorous discussions with Len during this particular period in time. She certainly wasn't going to go out of the house to be put on, and if she felt she was put on inside it, she was definitely clearly going to stick up for herself, and clearly good. So they moved down to Cheshire. And what happened was Len said, well, take a break. And to be honest, she was bored sick. So she asked the union, is there a company I can join? And they said, yeah, join Chadwick's. She says, well, how much are they getting paid? And she was getting 18 quid at the other place. And they said to her, well, they're getting 7 guineas. She said, I've never been paid 7 guineas. What's that all about? Anyway, the place was a shithole. That's the only words you could possibly use. And eventually she picked her way through. She got rid of the mother of the chapel. She replaced her as the mother of the chapel. And over a period of time, she again boosted the rates of pay amongst women and amongst men. She went round, she did the basic stuff. She didn't rely on management taking subs directly at source. She went and collected themselves. She built up a body of information, and she began to work to collect other people who would struggle for the sorts of things that they'd already identified themselves. Typical shop stewards and safety rep position. She continued. SOGAT came along. This is a very potted piece, I have to say now. She went back to the SOGAT biennial delegate conference in Scarborough. She was really pleased at this point to start and see increasingly larger numbers of women being involved in the trade union movement, and also working class women. She often won resolutions in opposition to the EC. They would oppose the resolutions and she would win them. However, what happened was the EC would often ignore those winning resolutions, and you would see her coming back a couple of years later saying, well, we passed this resolution, but the top table has not acted. She was very vociferous in criticising large sums of money which were spent by full-time officers at biennial delegate conference, and the staying in places of what can only be described as opulence. She got sick at Chadwick's, and she went off. She went and became a driver for the co-op. Again, she wasn't going to do anything in the union. It was us door, but she did. She became the steward. Usual tale, as they would say. By the 70s, she was getting on, and she decided that she would quit. This might have been enough for a few of us, but not Betty. She thought, right, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll educate myself. So she went off to do an Industrial Relations and Trade Union Studies course at the Middlesex Polytechnic. She wasn't content with that. She became the chair of the Labour Society. She chaired the various meetings. On a course, she did a dissertation, and she chose the Factories Act and women's employment. And she was not surprised, but was disappointed when she wrote to a number of major trade unions, including her own, asking for statistics on the number of women and the hours they worked. And she found that only a couple of them, the NUJ being one and the National Union of Railwaymen, collected such statistics. And of course, if you don't have those statistics, what it means is you're not interested, you're not bothered, and you're not going to act on it. So it confirmed to Betty that there was a continuing and ongoing struggle to be had. She did exceptionally well. She nearly got a distinction. The following year, she went off to Liverpool Poly. She started a degree. She quit it after a year. She didn't like the sort of atmosphere of that extended university or polytechnic thing. So she packed it in. She then went to work out. She set up a women's refuge in Warrington, and there's a piece, quite a 2 or 3 pages in the booklet about the establishment of that, during which she found that middle-class women were happy enough to be associated with that initial getting it off the ground, getting the publicity, but then didn't hang around too long to actually do the difficult work, which was to go and see women who perhaps might need to move out of where they were living. So again, there's a description of that. And she comes on later on to be active in the National Assembly of Women, she joined it in 52, but naturally she was super busy. She had a family, she had a couple of kids, husband, work, involvement in the wider trade union and labour movement. And I've not touched on the fact that she also later became a local labour councillor as well, one of the first locally. And so she joined the National Assembly of Women. She became very active in it. Her file at the Working Class Movement Library is stuffed full of letters that she wrote on behalf of the National Assembly of Women to all sorts of people. Saddam Hussein criticising his politics towards the autonomous region in Kurdistan, people, the Pinochet down into South Africa, writing to the people who were keeping apartheid things. She sadly lost Len at quite an early age, and this was a difficult time, but she moved back to Rawtenstall. She was nearer to Pat, and that was obviously of great pleasure. She opened a little market stall, which she enjoyed selling things. And then as she went on, she became particularly interested in work around Palestine. Unfortunately, Linda Clare, who I was hoping would be on here to speak at length about that, her Zoom mechanism doesn't work as good as obviously the rest of us, as it would say, although I'm hearing that a few people are difficulty in hearing some of the situation. And she was massively involved in the issue of Palestine throughout the rest of her life. But more importantly, persuaded Linda Clare to go to Palestine and to visit. And as people I'm sure on here know far better than I do, Linda has been a great supporter of the Palestinian cause in the last 25 years across the Northwest and obviously into Palestine itself, providing funds, organising speakers, meetings of which Betty herself went to. Again, there's details of that in the book. The bit I do particularly like, though, about the National Assembly of Women stuff is when she was asked in 1980 to go and meet the Soviet and American negotiating teams on medium-range nuclear missiles. And so they met them, and basically what happened was the American guy said didn't need to sign any new agreement to bring about less nuclear weapons, because basically America will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. Betty's temper must have been boiling, because obviously she shouted out, "But you bloody have." And we're of course referring back to that May 1945 episode, and the only time so far, thankfully, that happened. No great surprise, there was no, the Americans didn't really want to sign the deal at that point. And so there was other things. Betty went around, she supported the Greenham Common women. She later supported the miners' strike for obvious reasons. The photograph, which we showed, was in obviously in the Lenin Stadium. There's a great photograph also of her with one of the most active Soviet thing, Valentina, told about space, all them sorts of things. All of those things are pretty well covered in the booklet as a result of Betty's own work. She herself later on enjoyed going on holidays and to other locations and to meeting people. And she talks about one of the holidays where she went sadly to the concentration camp and the impact that it had on her in terms of the thing. She met Winnie Mandela, which, you know, a fantastic occasion for Betty, and a demonstration of her standing within the trade union and labour movement. That was the case. And there's a whole chapter in there, her relationship with Linda Clare, and which I'd recommend. You can listen into these books as well, and it covers that. And then towards the end, I'm talking here about at the end of the book, I'm conscious of the time. She was very active in C&D, and I think really that's where I might even pass on to Neville if we can at this particular stage, because I'm conscious I've been rabbiting on for a little while.
We need to get to the end of the slides, Mark. If we can just carry on with that, then we can open it up. Okay.
All right, brilliant. Well, as people know, there's quite a few slides there. You know, that's Betty outside. That's 1997, isn't it, when Nick Griffin was on, as it goes. As it happens, as I have some knowledge of in that particular situation, thanks to a mate of mine, he did actually get pulled at that particular period. So my mate was in Beck2, and they did actually pull the thing. So I'm not sure. That might be one in Manchester. Certainly the one in London, I think that's the last time it ever happened. We did actually manage to stop the broadcast, which was nice. There's one of our many letters. There's lots of letters complaining, basically, that, you know, why are we going through austerity when the level of GDP is nothing like it was in 1945, or, to be honest, in most other occasions. So directly challenge it, and you'll find loads of them. There's loads of little beautiful notes like that. That's what I can't actually completely see that myself, but there's the National Assembly of Women, very, very active, plenty of stuff in our own work. The other thing to be said is, of course, that Lynette and the Working Class Movement and Library have 6 hours of tape of Betty, which does need putting onto perhaps something a little bit more solid and a bit more permanent, and you know, really does need a listening and going through. So you know, it shows that the importance of the working class movement and other similar institutions across the country. There are not enough of them, obviously. There probably never will be, to be fair. So that is there. So if you want to actually hear our voice ourselves, you can do so. They're outside there, scrap trident, you know, taking the struggle directly, you know, and then of course the infamous or famous one where they went up to Faslane to mount a protest which was designed at the Trident nuclear submarine base, and that's Neville can give us a bit more details about that as we go on. Sadly, everyone's life has to come to an end. In Betty's case, she would have been antagonised and was antagonised immensely at the fact that Donald Trump was coming into view just as she was leaving, as they would say. there's a photograph of the retrobit. There's a photograph of obviously people at Faslane. I did have an original photograph from Neville, but for some reason it seemed to degenerate the last things, which is why I haven't included it in this particular thing. There's Pat with some of her mum's awards and A Time to Remember. That is Betty's autobiography to 1997, which I've added to, had edited the booklet myself, which the Union publishes, about 18,000 words. So it's readable in a couple of half a day, I would say. You can also listen to it on various mediums. Pat provided quite a number of the photographs for the booklet. We certainly weren't able to get them all into the piece of work. Those are just some of the other booklets that the Union has published in this series. There's others which I haven't got on there. There's the one of Tony Hall, who was a cartoonist, a radical cartoonist, very good friend of mine, anti-fascist, who got sent down. And there is a one which was done on Edward McHugh, who was the leader of the National Union of Dock Labourers in Liverpool in the 1890s, and for whom we put up a headstone last year in his memory. And this is just, I do about a day and a quarter each month for the Union. It's also involved plaque projects, recording plaques and getting plaques placed in locations. The current one, which we're on with, is trying to get a plaque to anti-fascist radical docker Mickey Fenn, who died back in 1996. When he died, me and my friend John, who were sacked from Wapping, said that we would wait the 20 years and then we would attempt to get a plaque up to him. We did raise $8,500 at the time, which we gave to the newly opened Dockers Club in Liverpool. So we're seeking to do that. Julia Varley, it looks like there'll be a square, one of the most prominent squares in a major city centre, named after a female trade unionist in her hometown in Bradford. So Betty hasn't been long gone. But whoever it is to stay, the generation, in 15 years' time. You can get plaques up after 15 years in the Manchester area, because I put one up last year for the Professional Footballers Association to John Aston Senior, and I checked that, and it's 15 years in the Manchester area. So totaling it up, it basically means you can do that in 2032. So if anybody's still on here, then hopefully we'll get a plaque up to her. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you very much. And yes, people are doing that thing of applauding, thumbs ups and things. So thank you very much indeed for that. This is the strange way this works these days, Mark. But right. So thank you for that. Now, what I'm going to do is try and find amongst the many people who are here. Where is Nev? There he is. Right. Okay. Nev, I've unmuted you. Hello? Nev, can we hear you? Oh. Hello, Nev. Mark, I'm afraid that doesn't seem to be working.
Oh dear.
Hello? Hello?
Shall I do it then, or shall I speak on his behalf? I don't.
Yes, I think yes. I'm sorry, that's not working, and the unmuting. It depends, because he wasn't on video, so perhaps his Zoom connection isn't so good. That's a shame. That's a shame.
Okay. Well, what happened was, in the late 90s, Betty moved to Prestwich, and she became very active in the local C&D branch, of which Neville is a passionate member and has been a passionate member of for many years. They struck up a very strong friendship, and Neville was a great source of support to Betty. whose eyesight was deteriorating, when she actually later went to speak at various conferences. Well, if Jacqueline wants to speak about the protests, that would be fantastic.
Okay, all right, go for it, Jackie.
Yeah, hiya, and that was really good. Thank you. It's always lovely to talk about Betty. I'm one of the workers for Greater Manchester and District CND, so I know Betty and Neville and everybody that was involved with that very, very well. And it was just a fantastic thing. So you have these conversations like. Betty was deciding whether she was going to wear handcuffs or thumb cuffs, or how she was going to actually handcuff herself to the two fellas on either side of her. So we were having that sort of conversation, and then I was having a conversation with her and saying, you know, have you all practiced, because it's all going to have to happen really, really quickly. And actually, as it happened, it didn't. It didn't all need to happen very, very quickly, because they were really to the police. That were looking on, vast majority of them who were young, they were a group of elderly people just sort of sauntering around. So it was a big surprise to them when they all suddenly lay down in the road, and they actually had time. The police were so surprised that they actually had time to handcuff themselves to each other. And in fact, one young police officer went up to Betty and was so concerned about her that he took his jacket off and rolled it up and put it over her head. And then they sort of cordoned them off, as they do. They put some barriers around them while they were cutting them out. So that was all going on. You could hear her chatting away, and then they were taken off to be processed, and then off to the police station. And my job on that day was to make sure that all of the people from Greater Manchester had support. So anybody that was taken off to police stations, I found out where the Greater Manchester lot were taken to, and then I went there so that they knew that when they came out, whether that be as Betty came out, as you said, Betty came out a bit earlier than everybody else. Some people were kept in overnight. That there was somebody there, a friendly face there, that could help them to get back to where they needed to get back to. So I was sat with my book waiting. I was ready and thinking that it was going to be a really long night. So I'd taken a book with me to sit in the sort of the reception area. And then Betty came out, and a couple of her other friends had been released from one of the other police stations. And one of the first things Betty said was, right, well, now that's done, are we going to go and have a Chinese? And she was just she was thrilled. She was high on adrenaline. She thought that it was the best thing, because as we know, it was the first time that Betty had ever been arrested. And she was just absolutely thrilled, and thought that it was brilliant, and was chuffed to mittens about it all, and really enjoyed talking to everybody about it. And she came to a couple of demonstrations up at Faslane, but that was the first time that she actually took direct action. And it was great, and it was very joyful. It's a scary thing to do, but it was very, very joyful, and she enjoyed it immensely.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jackie. Now we have got the chat button here. If anyone wants to use that chat button to ask a question, please do, and we can read them out for Mark to answer. So has anybody got? I think there was a question already that for you, Mark, which was about which battle was Betty's husband killed in. Do you know the answer to that?
It's a good question, and I think I do know the answer. It's in her autobiography. They'd reached Paris. I know that. He hadn't trusted the French farmers. They'd been told to be a bit careful, because the French farmers had done quite well under Nazi occupation. But they found when they got to the towns that they had been exceptionally well received there. I can't say for certain in the booklet. I mean, if anybody wants to find out, they can email me. I can send them the details. I'm sure it's somewhere up there because I've got work. I've got Betty's work up there.
Okay. We'll try and find that one out. As good librarians, we can help with that. Yeah.
I mean, does it say on the thing? I can't. It's only a small. 2 seconds.
Well, while you're doing what have you done? This, the person who's asked, is this talk available as a recording? It will be. It will be on our YouTube channel. Hang on a minute. It'll be on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. So youtube.com/WCM Library, and then you can watch it from the start. Okay. Right. Thank you, Mark. Sorry.
He was killed on the 19th of July, and it just says in Northwest, 19th of July, 1944, in Northwest Europe. That's all it says at this stage.
Okay.
Can ask Pat. Obviously, she'll know. Yeah, pretty sad.
Do we have anyone want to type as a question, or does anyone want to wave at me because you have something to say? Rika, hi.
Thanks, Lena.
Hello.
Hang on. Stop, Rika. We can't hear you. Something went wrong there. Try again, Rika.
I was just saying thank you for hosting
It's a pleasure.
talk. Very, very much. There was so much in it. It was very, very full. Just one little anecdote. It's not a question so much, but Bernard Barry's 2 granddaughters, my daughters, people at the library will know my late father, who was a volunteer at WCML. But we were having a conversation about 25 years ago. They're both in their 40s now. And it was just an ordinary family conversation. And when I explained that in my working lifetime, women simply got less pay because they were women than men, and the faces of those 2, not yet quite young women, they were still girls, their faces absolutely dropped to the floor. And I knew then that the legacy of all the sorts of things that Betty and other women had done, including my mum, who was active in the National Assembly of Women, to get equal pay and other rights for women, we'd won through, because it was just not part of my daughter's mentality that should exist, that women should be treated unequally on pay simply because they were women. And I knew then there was something new here, that they wouldn't accept it. They couldn't cope with it. Their jaws just dropped when I told them that. So it's part of the legacy of Betty's work, for women. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Rika. And as Rika says, her father, Bernard Barry, was a volunteer for many years at the library. And just to let you know, Rika, that his legacy carries on, because just this morning somebody bought his book from Manchester to Spain on our online bookshop. So there you go.
Can I just answer that question?
Okay, sure. Sorry, Mark, go on.
There was a question asking, had her children followed on? Not in Glyn's case particularly, but Pat became a steward in Newby for a number of years, and has always maintained an involvement in finding out what her mum is doing, and has always supported bringing her mum's history to life to other people. So she's been very supportive in that respect. But neither of them have been as actively involved as Betty was, no.
Okay. A question about whether there was any connection with the co-op movement. She seems like the sort of person who would have been involved.
There's quite a lot of pages in there. Answers, I can't answer that question. I'll have to have a look, basically. I suspect she was, but there's a stack of stuff in it. I mean, the aim of the booklets is to, first and foremost, it's really about working class people who from the legacy unions of Unite. And my aim is to talk about what she or he did at work to improve terms and conditions and things like that. And it's a bit like, it's one of the reasons I did the one about Benny Rothman, because if you ask about Benny Rothman, people just mention the fact that he was involved at the Kinder Scout trespass. Most people don't even know that Benny, I mean, he was a right little hard geezer. I mean, he was a little lapsed Jewish lad who went out and organised these mates to attack and to intimidate Mosley's, black shirts across Manchester in the 1930s. And he did it very successfully. And yet you wouldn't know that from what is being said about it. He became a cuddly character towards the end, didn't he? In terms of what was being said. 50 years after the Kinder Scout trespass, the Ramblers even let him join and gave him an award in essence. And he had things named after him. But Benny Rothman was no nice, cuddly character. Let's face it, Betty Tebbs was no nice, cuddly character. She was determined to be resilient and to fight for what she believed in. And by necessity, that does mean you come into difficulties and you have to fight your corner. You have to have an internal strength which you draw upon. And we're talking working class militants. When we're talking Edward McHugh in Liverpool, when you're talking Benny Rothman, when you're talking Tony Hall, when you're talking Tom Jones, who went and was left for dead in Spain and survived and came home and was the last man released and then went on to have a great trade union career and the rest. And we are talking people who have got some, let's be honest about it, they're not going to be fucked with. They are going to be fighting on behalf of their class. And you have to have that internal strength which goes with it, because to be fair, being a socialist is often one of long struggle and one long series of losses. And you have to be able to understand and to work with that and not lose the fact that that struggle is longer than our life in that way. And Betty exemplified that. She went to her grave being absolutely grumbling to hell that Donald Trump was coming along. She didn't want to leave this world with him basically being the top dog. And unfortunately, she did. And it's for the rest of us, isn't it, to understand that we need to play our roles and pass those roles on to other people. And so that's the case. That's what the stories are intended to do. That's how they intended to be written, so that they're not cuddly stuff. I'm not attempting to be cuddly here, basically,
Well, okay. The Working Class Movement Library is not cuddly either, though. We hope that we're warm and we're welcoming, but cuddly is not what we're aiming for. So thank you very much. But have we got anybody who wants a final thing to say about Betty? I want to make sure we've not missed anybody. Let me just jump to the second screen. Oh, Eleanor is waving at me. Yes, hello, Eleanor.
Yep. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. Yeah.
Hi. I can remember meeting Betty at a National Assembly of Women AGM at Wortley Hall, the workers' stately home, as people call it. She was one of the executive members there, had decided that rather than just have a normal debate, we'd actually sort of have a bit of creative thinking. So suggesting we put up Post-its, right, with ideas on, and we'd go round and get them all in and all the rest of it. And the idea, but anyway, I always remember Betty saying, Post-its, what are these Post-its? And so she wanted traditional ways of doing things, like having a good debate.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that. We have got another question coming in here, Mark. What were Betty's reflections in later life on the collapse of the Soviet Union and socialist countries?
Well, I think Betty was disappointed, to be fair. I think, well, she expresses her disappointment in the piece of work, and obviously the National Assembly of Women were closely aligned with the Soviet bloc, and she had she bought the newspaper, Daily Worker, the Morning Star, so she was disappointed, and I think she felt that what had happened to the workers in that area, that many of them had become poorer as a result of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. She doesn't speak to too much at great length about that, to be honest with you. She had, I think her and Linda joined the New Worker for a while, which is the new Communist Party, and then left as well. But Betty was she was a doer in that way. She would have continued, she would have, I was just saying, Paula, she continued to try and fight on behalf of her class, without doubt, at the same time seeking a different form of society than capitalism. That would be the easiest, I would say. I mean, there's a bit in here, and Linda would, I think Linda probably does sum it up very well. If I can just find that very, very quickly. She was not strong on communist theory, but Len had taught her a lot. But she knew that the working class was the only class with the numbers, the courage and genuine need to build a communist society in which each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. She is very strong on fighting, especially within the trade union movements, for women's rights, and had embraced equal pay for work of equal value. Linda does make some criticisms about how Betty would be stridently opposed to religion, and she challenged her on occasions, believing that had left to some reactionary attitudes amongst her, and that is explored within the work as well. So that does get a mention, basically.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
I'm going to do one last trawl through this. If anybody, wave at me if you want to say something. I am going through and I cannot see anybody waving at me. So, okay, thanks to those of you who've contributed to the chat feature. Have a bit of a read of that, folks, if you haven't done, because there was some comments on there as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to Mark for doing his first Zoom talk. Not too traumatic, I hope, Mark. Thank you. It's a different kind of thing, but it's what we have. So thank you very much also to Maxine for introducing for us. And we're going to be doing the same this time next week. So 2 o'clock next Wednesday, there'll be a talk by Alison Fell. Now that was postponed from a few weeks back. Unfortunately, Alison had a funeral that she had to attend. We're very grateful to her for rescheduling, and her talk is going to be on the legacies of wartime strikes, interwar women trade union leaders in France and Britain. So please keep an eye on our events page, wcml.org.uk/events. And as we've said, this talk has been recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly. That's youtube.com/WCM Library. And as Maxine said at the beginning, just a reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. We would, however, encourage you, if you're able to support the library at this difficult time, to head to our website and click on the donate button. That would be terrific. Okay, so thanks again. As I say, goodbye till the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.